Alara stood at the edge of the grand balcony, gazing out over her home planet. The sky was a deep purple, lit by two suns that hovered in the distance. Her empire, a vast and powerful civilization, had flourished for centuries, untouched by the weaknesses of the human world. Alara, the princess of this empire, had been raised to believe in the superiority of her people. She had been trained in combat, diplomacy, and leadership. To her, no one could match the strength, intelligence, and power of her race. For as long as Alara could remember, she had been taught to command, to lead, to conquer. Her people respected her for her beauty and intellect, but above all they feared her. She was the princess who had never been questioned, who had always taken what she wanted with no hesitation. She had the best warriors, the finest technology, and the loyalty of every citizen in her empire. Yet as she stared out into the vastness of space, Alara couldn't help but feel a strange sense of emptiness. She had everything that her empire had to offer, but she felt a lack of something more, something she could not name. Perhaps it was the endless power, or the expectations placed on her, but Alara found herself becoming restless. The raw, human colonies in the nearby galaxy had been a source of much amusement for her. Weak, fragile creatures, they had no understanding of true strength. They had sent emissaries to her planet, begging for peace talks, but Alara saw through their feeble attempts. The humans, despite their advancements, were no match for her empire. She had long since dismissed the idea of negotiations as pointless. Why waste time on such inferior beings? But today her father, the emperor, had given her a direct order to meet with the humans. He had insisted that their expansion into neighboring territories could be a source of peace, that their world could benefit from a diplomatic alliance. Alara, however, was not pleased. She had grown tired of diplomacy. The humans had no place in her world, and she was not about to lower herself to their level. As she turned away from the balcony, her thoughts grew darker. Her father's orders had always been unquestionable, but today, something inside her snapped. She was no longer willing to play the role of the obedient princess, bound by the empire's rigid expectations. The human emissaries were scheduled to arrive within the hour, but Alara had no intention of following the agreed-upon terms. She was going to teach these humans a lesson they would never forget. Alara marched through the marble halls of her palace, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She passed through the grand corridors adorned with the finest art, representing centuries of conquest and power. Her guards, ever vigilant, stood at attention as she passed, their eyes following her every move. But today Alara felt different. She was no longer the princess who walked in the shadows of her father's empire. Today she was something more, something independent, something daring. Her plan was simple. She would intercept the human diplomats and make them understand their place. She would show them the might of her people, the strength they had never known. She was not going to sit down and talk about peace. She would make them fear her, make them see the consequences of their weakness. This was her galaxy, her empire, and she would remind them of that. As she entered the war room, her most trusted advisors were already gathered. They were discussing the upcoming meeting, trying to iron out the details of the peace treaty. Alara's presence immediately shifted the room's energy. Her advisors fell silent, watching her closely. They knew something was different. Alara's eyes burned with intensity, her jaw set in a firm line. "I will not go through with this peace meeting," she declared, her voice sharp and unwavering. The advisors exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to react. The emperor had ordered this meeting, and to defy him was unheard of. But Alara's eyes did not soften. She had made up her mind. "I will take matters into my own hands," she continued. "These humans have no place here. They will learn that their weakness will not be tolerated." The room fell into silence. Her advisors were not accustomed to hearing such defiance from the princess. They had always admired her strength and cunning, but this was different. Alara was not simply making a strategic decision. She was rejecting the very foundation of her empire's approach to diplomacy. For the first time, she was taking control of her own destiny. One of her advisors, an elder warrior named Drac, stepped forward cautiously. "Princess, I understand your anger, but the Emperor's orders no longer matter," Alara interrupted, her tone final. "I am the future of this empire. I will not be a puppet in my father's game." Drac's expression hardened, but he said nothing more. He knew better than to challenge Alara directly, but he also understood the danger of her actions. If Alara went through with her plan, it could lead to a conflict that would tear the galaxy apart. But Alara did not care. She had always been the one in control, and today she was taking her power back. She dismissed her advisors and prepared to face the human diplomats head-on. The message was clear. They would either bow to her will or face the consequences. As she walked toward the meeting chamber, Alara's heart raced with excitement. For the first time in years, she felt alive. The anticipation of what was to come filled her with a dark thrill. She knew she was about to make a bold move, one that would reshape her destiny and the fate of the humans. Nothing, and no one, would stand in her way. Alara's rebellion had begun, and there was no turning back. Alara's heart pounded as she stepped into the grand hall, where the human emissaries awaited. The large marble chamber was illuminated by soft shimmering lights that reflected off the smooth walls. She could feel the cold stone beneath her boots, the silence of the room weighing heavily on her. The human diplomats stood in front of her, eyes filled with uncertainty but also a trace of curiosity. They had no idea what was coming. Ethan, the lead human envoy, stood at the forefront, his posture confident but not arrogant. He was a man in his mid-30s, with short-cropped dark hair and eyes that seemed to see through the surface of things. His reputation as a skilled negotiator had preceded him, but he was no fool. He had heard the rumors about Alara, about the princess who had defied her father's orders and rejected peaceful negotiations. Still, he had hoped that this meeting would go differently. But as soon as Alara entered the room, he knew something was wrong. Alara didn't waste any time with pleasantries. She marched up to the table, her presence filling the room. "The peace talks are over," she announced, her voice clear and cold. "There will be no agreement between our people. I am not here to talk. I am here to teach you a lesson." Her eyes burned with fierce determination. She had made up her mind and nothing would change it. Ethan raised an eyebrow, a slight frown on his face. He had dealt with stubborn leaders before, but this was different. This was no ordinary diplomatic negotiation. He could see the fire in Alara's eyes, the unyielding arrogance. She was determined to show her superiority, and it was clear she underestimated him. "Princess Alara," Ethan said calmly, his voice steady and firm. "I understand your position, but I urge you to reconsider. A war between us would lead to destruction for both our peoples. This is not the way to prove your strength." Alara laughed, the sound echoing through the hall. It was a laugh full of disdain. "Strength? You humans speak of strength as if you know what it truly means. You have no understanding of what power is. I will show you how the true rulers of this galaxy act." Before anyone could react, Alara raised her hand. A wave of energy surged from her, a display of the raw power that came from her alien heritage. The air hummed with electricity, and the diplomats flinched in response. It was a clear warning. Alara was not playing games. She had come here to dominate, to remind the humans of their place. But Ethan did not flinch. He stood his ground, eyes fixed on her. His calm demeanor never wavered. He had been trained for moments like this, moments where pride and arrogance clouded judgment, and he knew that if he allowed Alara to continue, things would spiral out of control. "Princess," Ethan said again, his voice now taking on a sharper edge, "you don't have to do this. There's still a chance to turn back." Alara's gaze narrowed. She wasn't used to being challenged. Not like this. Humans had always been beneath her, but Ethan's calmness unsettled her. This was not the reaction she had expected. She had hoped for fear, for submission, but instead, she saw something else in his eyes, something far more dangerous. "You speak as though you can stop me," Alara said, her voice filled with venom. What makes you think you can control me, human? Ethan took a step forward, his eyes locked onto hers. Because I understand one thing you don't. Real strength isn't about power or force. It's about knowing when to hold back, when to think, and when to act with wisdom, not just impulse. Alara froze. The words hit her like a slap to the face. For the first time, doubt crept into her mind. She had always relied on her power, on the belief that her strength was enough to solve every problem. But Ethan's words made her question everything. Before she could react, Ethan continued, his voice steady. You've made a mistake, Alara, and you'll learn that sometimes it's the quietest voices that carry the most weight. With that, Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device. It was a simple-looking tool, no more than a few inches long, but it held a powerful secret. With a press of a button, the device emitted a frequency that disrupted Alara's control over her power. The wave of energy that had surged through the room suddenly faltered, flickering like a dying flame. Alara's eyes widened. What have you done? Ethan didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, watching her reaction. For the first time, Alara felt vulnerable. The device had neutralized her abilities, leaving her defenseless. It was a reality she wasn't prepared for. You can't rely on power alone, Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. You must learn to think beyond force. This is what it means, to be truly strong. Alara staggered back, her mind racing. She had never been in this position before. For the first time, she was the one who had been outsmarted. The human had not only disarmed her physically, but had also managed to challenge her belief in her own superiority. Her pride, her arrogance, all of it was being tested in that single moment. Ethan's calmness, his ability to face her without fear, had shattered the foundation of everything she had known. The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Alara looked around at the human diplomats who were watching the scene unfold with a mixture of awe and fear. Ethan had done the unthinkable. He had not only stood up to her, but had forced her to confront a harsh reality. In that silence, Alara's anger burned hotter than before, but now it was mixed with a sense of uncertainty. The lesson had been taught, and it was one she would not forget. Alara's mind raced as the harsh reality of her situation set in. For the first time in her life, she felt a deep, unshakable sense of weakness. The human Ethan had done the unimaginable. He had stripped her of the power that she had always relied on, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. Her arrogance, her unchallenged belief in her superiority had led her to this point. She had always prided herself on being in control. The princess of a powerful empire, the most skilled warrior, the most intelligent strategist, Alara was used to being the one who dictated the terms, the one who commanded fear and respect. But now, she stood before the humans, feeling as though the very foundation of her existence was crumbling. Ethan's calmness haunted her. How had he been able to outwit her so easily? She had underestimated him, and that mistake had cost her dearly. But as the silence in the room stretched on, Alara knew that this was far from over. She would not let a human make a fool of her. No, she would regain control, and she would show Ethan that she was still the one in charge. You've made a grave mistake, Alara finally spoke, her voice low and filled with barely contained fury. Her words echoed through the chamber, and for a moment it seemed as though the very air around her thickened with tension. Ethan remained calm, his expression unreadable. No, princess, the mistake was yours. The words stung more than Alara was willing to admit. She clenched her fists, trying to rein in the surge of emotions that threatened to boil over. Her pride, her anger, everything was fighting for dominance within her. She was a princess, a leader, and she had to remind herself of that. I will not be humiliated like this, she muttered under her breath, her voice barely audible to those in the room. She turned sharply, her long, dark hair swirling behind her as she stormed out of the chamber. She had to regain control. She had to show them all that she was still the one in power. Outside the chamber, the cool metallic halls of the palace offered little comfort. Alara walked swiftly, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts trying to make sense of what had just happened. She had never known such defeat, and it gnawed at her insides. The device that Ethan had used on her was still with her. It felt like a weight in her pocket, a constant reminder of her failure. She had underestimated him, and in doing so she had given him the power to take away everything she held dear. The thought of it twisted in her gut. But Alara wasn't someone who gave up easily. She had never been one to accept defeat. If anything, this humiliation only fueled her determination. She would find a way to regain her power, to show Ethan and the humans that she was not to be trifled with. They would see that she was more than just brute force. She was a leader, and she would make them bow to her. As she made her way to her private quarters, Alara's mind began to race with plans. She would find a way to neutralize the device Ethan had used on her. She would learn how to counter it, how to protect herself from the humans' manipulation. And once she had regained her strength, she would turn the tables on them. But deep down, Alara knew that this would not be easy. The power she had always relied on was no longer within her reach. She had been forced to confront a truth she had long ignored. Strength was not only about power and domination. There was a deeper kind of strength, one that came from understanding, from wisdom, from knowing when to hold back. Alara had always thought of herself as invincible, but now she understood that true strength lay in adaptability. She could no longer afford to rely solely on her physical power. She needed to learn how to wield influence in other ways. And Ethan, he had shown her that. Whether she liked it or not, the human had given her a lesson that she could not ignore. In the privacy of her quarters, Alara began to meditate. She closed her eyes and focused on the stillness within her, trying to center herself. The anger, the frustration, it was all still there, swirling just beneath the surface. But she knew that if she was to regain control, she needed to clear her mind. The minutes stretched into hours as Alara worked through her emotions. Slowly, she began to calm herself, her thoughts becoming clearer. She thought back to the moment when Ethan had neutralized her powers. It hadn't been with force, but with strategy. It hadn't been her physical strength that had been defeated, but her pride, her arrogance. She had allowed herself to become blind to her own limitations. As Alara opened her eyes, she felt a shift within herself. The anger was still there, but it was no longer all-consuming. She understood now that she had to grow. She had to evolve. If she wanted to truly regain control, she would need to learn how to be more than just the strongest. She would need to be wiser, more strategic, and more adaptable. The road ahead would not be easy. She knew that. But Alara was no stranger to challenges. She had always risen to the occasion, and this time would be no different. She would face the consequences of her actions, but she would also learn from them. And in doing so, she would become stronger than she had ever been before. As the sun set outside her window, casting a warm golden glow across the room, Alara made a silent vow to herself. She would not let this setback define her. She would rise, more powerful than ever, and she would make Ethan and the humans see that the princess they had underestimated was far from finished. Alara stood at the edge of the palace balcony, staring out at the vast horizon before her. The two suns hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the planet's surface. A gentle breeze stirred her hair, but she hardly noticed. Her thoughts were far away, lost in a whirlwind of emotions and reflections. It had been days since the fateful confrontation with Ethan, the human envoy who had challenged her in ways no one ever had before. At first, Alara had been consumed by anger, humiliated by the way she had been outsmarted and defeated. But as the days passed, she found herself replaying the moments in her mind, seeing them not through the lens of rage, but with a growing sense of understanding. She had always believed that strength came from control, from the ability to dominate and command. That had been her way, her empire's way. But now she could not deny it any longer. Ethan had shown her that true strength came from something deeper, something more than just raw power. It came from wisdom, patience, and knowing when to yield, when to listen. It was something that could not be measured by physical might alone. Alara had learned her lesson the hard way, but the lessons she had learned were worth the pain. The arrogance that had once defined her was slowly being replaced by humility. She had come to realize that the world was not as simple as she had thought, and that there was much more to leadership than just commanding respect through fear. A soft knock at her door broke her from her thoughts. She turned to find her trusted advisor Drax standing in the doorway. He was an older warrior, one who had served her family for many years. His stern expression softened when he saw her, but he said nothing. Instead, he simply stepped aside to allow Ethan to enter. The human stood in the doorway, his posture relaxed but still carrying the weight of authority. Alara's heart skipped a beat as she saw him. Still the same calm, unflinching man who had challenged her. But now the anger that had once surged within her was gone. In its place was something else. Curiosity, respect. "You wanted to see me?" Ethan asked, his voice steady as ever. Alara nodded, taking a deep breath. For a moment she said nothing. The words she wanted to say were hard to find. But she had come to understand that silence was no longer an option. She had to face the truth of what she had become, and she had to do it now, with him standing before her. "Ethan," she began, her voice surprisingly steady, "I owe you an apology." Ethan raised an eyebrow, but he said nothing. His eyes remained warm, open, waiting for her to continue. "I was wrong," Alara continued, her voice softer now. "I thought I could solve everything with power. I believed that strength came from fear, from control. But you showed me that there is another way, a better way." There was a long pause, and Alara felt the weight of the moment settle in. It wasn't easy for her to admit her faults, to acknowledge that she had been wrong. But she knew that this was the only way forward. She had to face the truth, not just for herself but for the future of her people, her empire. "I was too blind to see it before," she said, looking Ethan directly in the eyes. "I thought you were just a weak human, someone to be ignored, but you showed me that strength isn't just about power. It's about understanding, about knowing when to act with wisdom instead of force. You taught me that." Ethan stood there for a moment, his expression unreadable. Alara held her breath, unsure of how he would respond. But after what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "Alara," he said softly, "I didn't teach you anything you didn't already have within you. You've always had that strength, but it was buried under your pride. You just had to learn to see it. And now you have." Alara's heart swelled with something she hadn't expected. Gratitude. Ethan wasn't angry with her. He wasn't seeking revenge. Instead, he had offered her the very lesson she had so desperately needed. He had shown her that redemption wasn't just about regaining control. It was about becoming something better, something wiser. For the first time, Alara felt the full weight of what she had learned. It wasn't about regaining her previous strength. It was about becoming someone who could lead with compassion, with a deep understanding of those around her. She had been humbled, and that humility had transformed her in ways she hadn't thought possible. "You're right," she said quietly. "I've been too focused on what I thought was power. I've been too focused on myself." Ethan smiled, a small, knowing smile that spoke volumes. "You're not alone in this, Alara. You don't have to carry the weight of your empire on your own. True strength comes when you allow others to stand with you, when you learn to trust them, and when you trust yourself." Alara nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. This was the beginning of something new, something she had never imagined. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She was someone who could lead with wisdom, someone who could understand the true meaning of strength. And for the first time, she knew that she wasn't defined by her power alone. Her strength now came from her ability to change, to grow, and to lead with empathy. Ethan stepped forward, his gaze steady. "The future is yours, Alara. You have what it takes to be a great leader, not just for your empire, but for all beings, human and alien alike." Alara's eyes softened as she looked at him. For the first time, she felt the weight of her responsibilities not as a burden, but as a privilege. She had the power to shape the future, and she would do so with the lessons she had learned. "Thank you, Ethan," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "Thank you for showing me the way." And as they stood there side by side, Alara knew that this was just the beginning. There was still much to learn, many battles to face, and a future to build. But now she faced it with a new understanding, one that would guide her for the rest of her life.